Our final speaker of the session is Ray Wang. Ray is a senior staff software engineer at Google, and his research interest is in data center networking. And he's going to talk about Google's Jupyter Data Center. Let's get the slides up. Perfect.
Thank you, Mania. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be here to be sharing with you how we have transformed Google's Jupyter Data Center networks via optical circuit switching and software-defined networking. 10 years ago, we started off by building Jupyter in a classical 3-tier cloud topology, where machine aggregation blocks are interconnected by a layer of spine switches, providing more or less uniform bandwidth across tens of thousands of servers. A special block called Fabric Border Router, or FBR, provides the egress connectivity to campus and wide area networks. So what has changed in the past decade? First, we've introduced optical circuit switches, or OCS, as the interconnection and interoperation layer. Here's a visual of the front side of a single OCS chassis with dozens of optical fibers from aggregation blocks. Inside the OCS are arrays of the so-called MEMS mirrors that can steer light from any input port to any output port. Now, the nice thing about OCS is that it's data rate agnostic, so it doesn't have to be upgraded when the rest of the network transitions from 40 gig to 100 gig, 200 gig, and beyond. Second, we no longer use cloud topologies. We have eliminated the spine layer in favor of directly connecting the aggregation blocks in a mesh. Along with that, we have introduced dynamic topology and traffic engineering, which adapts this mesh connectivity and pathing to reflect the application communication patterns, as well as the speed heterogeneity that is present in all our fabrics. Lastly, Jupyter has become really a living and ever-evolving fabric, where capacity is incrementally added, removed, and refreshed. All these changes are orchestrated by our Orion SDN controller with no application visible impact. Now, taking a step back, why did we make those fundamental changes? The first observation is that spines make Jupyter evolution expensive. Well, to begin with, the spines make up roughly 40% of our fabric's cost, including power consumption. But there's more to that. Spines are usually pre-deployed, at least well ahead of aggregation blocks, to avoid fabric-wide rewiring and to provide uniform bandwidth. But over time, as we deploy new aggregation blocks with faster speed, the pre-deployed spines became the performance bottlenecks for these faster blocks, as their links are derated by the slower spines. Well, you may ask, why don't we refresh the spine layer? Well, refreshing the spine layer, even if it's just incrementally, would require fabric-wide rewiring and would be time-consuming and expensive, bordering impractical. The second observation is that the traffic patterns in our data centers are actually predictable. Cloud is great when traffic patterns are unknown or are shifting very fast and arbitrarily. However, we found that the aggregation block level traffic to be not only relatively stable and hence predictable, but also largely follows what we call a gravity model, which is quite benign. Now, to make no mistake, data center traffic is bursty and unpredictable at a small time scale. And that will be something we specifically need to handle in our traffic engineering design, and you'll hear more about it later. But data center traffic does exhibit large-scale structures that persist over time. Therefore, we believe building the network for the theoretical worst case would be an overkill. The third observation is that the power consumption per bit per second is not dropping as fast as it used to be. In other words, upgrading to the next generation of hardware has diminishing performance returns on our power investment. Now, this trend is calling for architectural change that would allow us to continue scaling our fabric in a cost-competitive fashion. So a quick recap. So taking these challenges and opportunities together, namely spines becoming bottleneck for heterogeneous fabrics, the need for structural savings, and the prospect of leveraging predictable traffic patterns, we responded, as I've described earlier, by re-architecting our Jupyter fabric into a direct connect mesh enabled by OCS and SDN-based topology and traffic engineering. So this re-architecture exercise has reduced 30% of our fabric's CapEx, 40% of its power consumption, all while improving flow completion time by 10% and throughput by 30%. The introduction of OCS has also made the fabric-wide topology reconfiguration not only touch-free, but tenfold faster than before. Now, one drawback of this new architecture is the increased complexity of topology and routing control. Now, let's walk through this new architecture in a bit more detail. Aggregation blocks largely remain unchanged. Each aggregation block is made up of 4 middle blocks, as we call them. A top-of-rack switch, or TOR, fans out to all 4 middle blocks. Each aggregation block is then connected by optical fibers to the data center network interconnection layer, or DCNI, which is made up of OCSs. Now let's zoom into one OCS and see how it configures the logical connectivity as seen by the aggregation blocks. Let's say we want to create a bidirectional logical link between block A and B. We would instruct the OCS to rotate those tiny mirrors to cross-connect a port from A to a port from B in both directions. Similarly, we create a direct link between B and C and between A and C, thus forming a mesh. Now, as we refresh 100 gig blocks with 200 gig, the nice thing about Direct Connect is that the direct links between the 200 gig blocks get to run immediately at 200 gig without needing to wait for the spines to get upgraded first. Next, I will describe a few key software components that enable this Direct Connect architecture. First up is traffic engineering. For the first time in our data center network, shortest path routing is no longer sufficient. Instead, we enable both direct and one transit indirect paths on the block level. We split traffic among multiple shortest and non-shortest paths while observing link capacity and real-time communication patterns. Today, this traffic engineering control loop operates on the order of second to minute, reacting to traffic changes and topology changes like failures and drains. Now, to explore the traffic engineering design space a little bit, we can imagine at one end of the spectrum, we have a demand-oblivious routing scheme like Valiant Load Balancing, or VLB, which, roughly speaking, splits the traffic equally across all available paths, direct and indirect. This scheme, while simple, results in a 2-to-1 oversubscription for all aggregation blocks. In other words, 50% of your aggregation block's bandwidth is to be used by transit traffic. To further illustrate this, we compared the bottleneck link load under VLB with that under an optimal routing. Here, optimal routing represents a rather idealized scenario where traffic matrix is known a priori, and each traffic is routed optimally to minimize the bottleneck link load. So it serves as a nice lower bound for our comparison. We see that the load under VLB is 82% higher than the lower bound. So this 2-to-1 oversubscription ratio proves too high for our fabrics, as many of our aggregation blocks run at utilization well above 50%. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we can imagine a fully dynamic and traffic-aware routing scheme that optimizes everything exactly to the predicted traffic matrix. While we stated earlier that the traffic is predictable to a large extent, the prediction is rarely accurate, as a matter of fact. Errors always exist in our prediction, large and small. So a routing solution optimized exactly to the traffic matrix runs the risk of overfit. As shown by the red waveform here, we see that while on average this scheme outperforms VLB, the link load spikes from time to time, a result of traffic misprediction. So we designed a scheme called variable hedging to hedge against different degrees of traffic misprediction. It allows us to operate on any point along the solution continuum, trading optimality under correct prediction for robustness under misprediction, or vice versa. As is shown by the orange waveform, variable hedging simultaneously achieves better performance on average and eliminates spikes from overfit. We also conducted an experiment in a moderately utilized production fabric. We disabled traffic engineering and ran oblivious routing VLB for 1 day. For obvious reasons, we didn't want to run this experiment on a hotter fabric. The performance difference between traffic engineering and VLB is quite obvious. Even though the fabric is only moderately utilized, we see TE has 12% lower latency and 14% higher throughput than VLB, while slashing the fabric-wide packet drops by more than half. Now, these gains are a result of traffic engineering reducing the transit load on the network by 26%. But even more important than that, TE strategically places the transit load where there is bandwidth stack, which there is a lot in our network, whereas VLB would indiscriminately place transit load everywhere, leading to hot aggregation blocks getting even hotter. Now, a second key component that enables direct connect architecture is what we call topology engineering. We have actually proved in the paper that a static uniform mesh is sufficient for homogeneous fabric, provided that the traffic follows the gravity model. Well, we already established that our fabrics are anything but homogeneous. So we need to use dynamic and traffic-aware topology to manage the speed heterogeneity. Let's consider a toy example of a 3-block Jupiter with two 200-gate blocks, A and B, and one 100-gate block C. Now, suppose the demand matrix as shown on the slide. You can see that it cannot be satisfied by uniform mesh topology on the left. But if we optimize the topology based on traffic, specifically creating more direct links between A and B, and route 5T demand from A to C through B, then the demand becomes satisfiable. This example illustrates how topology engineering exploits free transit capacity of a high-speed block, that is, in this case, block B, to serve the demand out of a hot block, A. Today, our topology engineering control loop operates on the order of days or even weeks, as the underlying changes driving the topology engineering are rather slow-moving. And we leave short-lived conditions like failures, drains, and traffic variations to be handled by dynamic routing. Let's look at the result from a fabric with a mixture of 40-gate and 100-gate blocks. Topology engineering increases the capacity on 100-gate blocks by as much as 20%. This is done through judiciously creating more links among the 100-gate blocks, just like we've shown earlier in the toy example. This has resulted in 32% higher throughput as well as reduced latency. Another reason for reduced latency is that the topology matches the communication pattern better, so more traffic ends up traversing the shortest path. Now, topology engineering would not have been possible without the OCS or the underlying SDN controller that executes the topology reconfiguration. The challenge here is maintaining sufficient capacity throughout the reconfiguration so there is no application visible impact. To that end, we developed two optimizations. First, we minimized the delta between successive topology optimizations without compromising on optimality. Second, we carefully break down the already small topology diff to a still finer-grained sequence of incremental link moves, as shown in the example at the bottom. This incremental reconfiguration further minimizes the unavailable capacity at each reconfiguration step and limits the blast radius of each change. A prime example of a fabric-wide topology reconfiguration is migrating a fabric from a closed topology to direct connect, all while serving live traffic. This picture, a snapshot from our production, shows how traffic gradually shifts from going over the spines to going over the direct connect links. To compare the performance before and after the conversion, we look at a recent conversion that was actually just concluded 2 weeks ago that was successfully executed on a fabric that is one of our hottest. This fabric contains roughly 50% of 40-gate blocks and 50% of 100-gate blocks. We can see that the 100-gate blocks see their throughput more than doubled after the conversion. even though its physical capacity did not double, because many of its links still run at 40 gig due to its peers. But it does get a throughput boost. On the other hand, the 40 gig blocks have similar performance before and after the conversion, as they were not bottlenecked by the spine in the first place. So this is how we have converted our fleet from CLO to Direct Connect. So to conclude, I'd like to summarize by noting that this Direct Connect Jupyter architecture has served in our production for more than 5 years. At this point, all new Jupyters are turned up in Direct Connect. And the vast majority of our fleet, which was based on CLO, has been migrated. With that, I am happy to take your questions.
Yiting Xia from Max Planck Institute for Informatics. Very nice talk, thank you. So I'm quite interested in the topology change. So I understand the design point of having infrequent topology change, and also you are minimizing the topology change from step to step. But still, traffic needs to be transitioned. So I'm wondering, during this traffic transition, is it live transitioning, or do you guys drain the traffic first? And during this time, how can you avoid routing loops and packet reordering?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Yitin. Yes, we do drain the traffic. Every time we touch a packet link, one way or another, you have to vacate the traffic first, right, to avoid traffic loss. Now, in terms of avoiding routing loops or black holes, it's not a specific problem to topology reconfiguration. Failures happens, topology changes. So this is a general problem that we need to handle, right? Especially, and this does become more complex with transit routing. And the paper goes into details into how we avoid specifically routing loops and black holes when failure happens.
Hello, Ray. Very nice talk. So you talked about traffic engineering, and I think we all know that demand prediction has always been a very challenging problem. So I'm just curious, does Google have any new insights on how to do it better? And also, curious if you actually rate limit the demand or you just predict them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for the question. We don't have a silver bullet to demand projection. I'm actually looking to the community here for actually maybe novel ideas to do demand projection. So as you rightly pointed out, and as we also pointed out in the talk, that the data center traffic is simultaneously predictable and unpredictable, right? So it does exhibit large-scale structures that persist over time, but at shorter time scale, it does vary a lot, very bursty. So that's why we built this particular mechanism to navigate between a completely demand-oblivious routing scheme, which is insensitive to demand changes, and on the other end, sort of overfit traffic engineering solution. And this dynamic, this traffic uncertainty actually varies from fabric to fabric. We have fabrics that are embarrassingly stable traffic pattern. So for those, you would operate much closer to the end of the spectrum where you optimize exactly, you path exactly to the predicted traffic. Whereas there are other fabrics where the traffic is a lot more bursty, where you want to operate closer to the end of oblivious routing. I don't remember you had another part of your question, or did I answer all of your questions?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, thank you.
Last question.
Hi. Sorry, I'm here.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, I am Ashkan, actually from Canada, Hawaii, actually Research Center. Thanks for your great presentation. So as you move actually from this hierarchical actually topology to the direct connect topology, I assume actually you reduce actually the tax rate actually for transmission actually for your flows. So do you have any like statistics for the power dissipation? How much actually this new approach was able to reduce the power consumption?
Sorry, I didn't get most of your question.
So as you move actually from the hierarchical topology to direct actually topology, so I assume actually so we call it actually tax rate. You decrease actually this extra hop. So do you have any estimation actually how much this actually new direct topology was able to reduce the power consumption?
Oh, how much direct?
How do you reduce the power consumption as
Oh.
you're moving from hierarchical to direct connect?
I mean, the way it's actually, we removed the power.
Multiple hops.
Yes, it's not taking more hops than before in a closed topology, because in a closed topology, your path always bounces off a spine block. So the power consumption is reduced just simply by removing the entire spine, which consists almost 50% of the network elements. So that's a huge chunk taken out immediately once we remove them.
Okay, thanks.
Last question, please.
Yep. Hey, Jun Kim from Princeton. Thank you for the talk. Great talk. My question is mostly just general questions about these OCS switches. They sound great. Are there any downsides of that? The three things I want to mention are what's the cost of these switches? Are they more expensive? You said there's moving mirrors inside switch. What's the reliability of these switches? Third thing is don't you lose any monitoring capabilities because they're just lights, and what's any monitorings happening? Do you lose that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Just as a full disclaimer, I'm a software engineer. I actually don't know, not an expert in OCS internals, but from what I understand, we have a phenomenal OCS team, and to make the OCS devices at this scale, at this deployment scale, right, and run it reliably, as you rightly called out. If it's not reliable, it's not deployable. So it's actually a phenomenal feat that the team pulled off. And I believe they're probably going to have an invited talk in the next year's OFC, and they're going to put up a paper that goes into a lot more details of the hardware design of the OCS and the deployment experience on archive. So do watch out for that.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ray. Thanks, everybody.